Hello, everyone, and greetings for the new year. I'm Tammy Queenie, and I'm an instructional designer with Clemson University Center for Workforce Development, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of CUCWD, I would like to thank each of you for joining us in this continued webinar series. This is the third webinar in our series of webinars. If you have missed the previous webinars, I have mentioned the link in this chat thread. Feel free to look them up at your convenience. Today's topic, enhancing a learner engagement through the use of immersive learning strategies, will be presented by Dr. Darren Brooks. You can find Dr. Brooks's bio in the link that I have mentioned in this chat thread. Before we proceed with this webinar, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. Firstly, this is a 1-hour webinar, and this webinar is being recorded. Secondly, all participants for this webinar are muted except for the presenters. Today's recorded webinar will be available to you in the next few days. As we'd like to encourage questions, please send them through this chat thread during the session, or later, you can email us at cucwd@clemson.edu. We'll be answering any additional questions at the end of this webinar. Given our time frame of 1 hour for this session, if we are unable to answer your questions during this hour, we'd be sure to follow up with you afterwards. And lastly, we'd encourage you to share today's webinar with your network. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by introducing our presenter for today, Dr. Darren Brooks, who is from my alma mater, Florida State University. He is the assistant chair in the Department of Management, the executive director for the Center for Human Resource Management, and the program coordinator in the College of Business. Under Dr. Brooks's guidance, I completed 2 very important courses during my Master's of Science in Instruction Systems and Learning Technologies, namely Training and Development and Managing Instructional Development. In these courses, I learned to explore numerous strategies to improve employee and organizational performance, and the design and development of instructional and non-instructional interventions to improve learning and performance. So that's the reason I believed that Dr. Brooks is the best presenter to help us all focus on how to promote learner engagement and how to integrate learners and content within authentic real-world situations. We also have with us today on our panel, Jeff Bertrand. He's the Director of Visualization from CUCWD. Jeff is a subject matter expert in the creation of virtual reality simulations, and he will discuss the topics related to VR simulations in today's session. Before we proceed with the webinar, we'd appreciate if you could all take a short survey right now, as this will help us understand our participants better. We will all pause for a few seconds to allow everyone to complete the short survey.
Almost there.
Yeah, almost there. So I'll just give them a few more seconds to complete the survey. So I believe if we have completed the survey, thank you all so much for completing the survey. Dr. Brooks, we request you to read the survey results and share them with our participants, and you now have the floor.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Tammy and Rebecca, for your invitation to join everyone today. Let me share the results that we have here. We've got roughly 14% of the participants are in instructor roles. We have a lot of faculty, almost half of the participants. We have staff and others. Oops, there we go. Let me share there. We've got a few researchers and others. Could be individuals that are in support roles or design roles as well. And again, similar. What is your affiliation? Looks like most of them come from university capacities. So quite a mixture of professionals on the call today. So I'm sure we'll have some great commentary as we get into the substance of today's conversation. So as I mentioned, thank you very much for the opportunity to come in and talk with you today. My natural style is to have this be as engaging as we possibly can. So as I'm going through certain things, I will prompt you for your interaction with me with certain questions. But as we go through certain things, as you have questions or even would like to share some experiences you have, please, as Tammy said, put those questions and comments in the chat so we can all benefit from that. So what I want to do today is really kind of share a little bit about some things that I've experienced and have been doing for a number of years to really kind of help with engagement. And I think it's fair to say that that's a topic that many of us run into on a regular basis when we just walk into our classrooms or we take a look at our course evaluation. So engagement is something that's usually at the front of mind for all of us. And then, of course, for researchers and people in industry, you have similar issues with your research studies as well as with some of your employees in your workplace. So what I hope to do is at least kind of share with you some perspectives that I've gained over the years through my research and through my practical experience. But I do want to make it known that while we talk about immersive learning, we're also expanding to more experiential and problem-based learning for today, because I wanted to provide some perspective for those instructors who may not be utilizing technology in the same way as maybe Dr. Bertram is using it, so that you can look at multiple ways that you can increase engagement in your students. So let's just kind of jump in and take a look at really kind of the elephant in the room and the premise for today, which is the issue of learner engagement. And when you think about the premise of engagement, I think you can break it into three primary buckets. One is the issue of motivation. And one of the things that we see when we interact with our students on a regular basis is there can be this lack of attention and focus, and it can kind of ebb and flow during the course and even during specific classes that we can see. And a lot of that, has to do with the structure and design of our courses. And we'll really kind of get into some of the ways that we can use immersive and experiential strategies to help improve that engagement. Another issue that relates to motivation is, of course, the relevancy of the content. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we tend to teach content in isolation. We don't necessarily present it in a way that's integrated into the world that our students are going to be using the information. I know, for example, if you're a parent, you probably hear this from your children. And I get this from my youngest son all the time, particularly in his math classes. When am I ever going to use Algebra 2? Now, I go into these diatribes about, how you're going to be using the premise and the basics of algebra in practically every field that you will engage in. But in terms of how he's experiencing that, he doesn't necessarily see the relevancy of some of the formulas and calculations that he's learning, because it's not taught in context with practical application. It's taught in its essence in isolation, and so that creates some motivational challenges and some breaks in engagement with some of our students. And then, the other issue relevant to motivation is the overall confidence. And when we start to think about immersive learning strategies and experiential learning strategies, we know through research that we see significant increases, as much as 20-25% increases, just when we look at simulations in incorporating gaming into our courses, increases of up to that percentage in overall self-efficacy. So we do know that by engaging them and immersing them into real situations and authentic real world problems, that they can start to see the relevancy of what they're doing and learning, and then that obviously impacts their attention and focus, and gives them a sense of confidence as well. So motivation is a key thing that we experience as it relates to challenges to learner engagement. When you start to think about motivation's impact on the learning experience, obviously when we have challenges with motivational aspects, we can see that there's an overall decline in general satisfaction with the learning experience. That can be manifest and described in a variety of ways, whether it's boredom, or the class is not applicable to what I need. There's a whole host of things, and I'm going to ask you to share some of your experiences in just a moment. But we do know when we struggle with the motivational components, that we do see an overall decrease in satisfaction in the learning experience. And then ultimately, what we want people to be able to do is perform certain types of skills and apply their knowledge either in later classes or when they graduate and are actually in the workplace. And so retention and transfer is affected when we have a lack in motivation, and we have decreases in the satisfaction of the learning experience. That affects how we process and encode information and then transfer it into new environments. And so the challenge of learning engagement as instructors and faculty members is something that's paramount to all of our concerns. So I've kind of talked a little bit more than I like to at the beginning. So I'd like to kind of hear from you. What are some things that you are challenged with in terms of engaging your students? So let's take just a couple of moments and let me see what you guys say. Well, I'm not seeing any chats coming in, any questions coming in. Here we go. The main challenge for me is dead air, right? That moment right after you talk, that is always a common thing, and we can talk a little bit about how using different strategies can affect that. One of the things that Dave brought up that I think is very important, and that we all kind of take a moment to talk a little bit about, is the personal impact of our current environment. I'd mentioned at the beginning of the call and just kind of our introductory conversations that some of our students are really experiencing a lot more challenges today, particularly with the impact of COVID, the remote nature of a lot of the instruction, personal challenges that people are experiencing. We know a lot of our students are experiencing some difficulties. And some of that also is, technological challenges as well. So there's a whole host of things that we have to take into consideration. But I also want to mention that, some of the challenges that we're facing are also at the faculty level. While we focus a lot on, student engagement and student mental health, we also have to look at our faculty as well and make sure that not only are they, prepared mentally to handle a course, but also they have the support that they need to operate in these new environments. So there's been some great commentary, that people have put out here. It's hard to engage when students don't have the camera on or they keep turning the camera off. We have kind of, some general ed classes that people are required to take. So there's not that necessarily, intrinsic interest in the content matter. So yes, there's quite a few challenges that we run into, and many of us experience a lot of the same things. So, take away from this interaction that you're not alone, that you're experiencing things that many of your colleagues are experiencing. So hopefully some of the things we'll talk about today will give you some ideas of how to incorporate these immersive and experiential strategies into your courses to help improve that overall engagement. Now, before we kind of jump into some of the more specific aspects of these strategies, I want to kind of give you some foundational information that kind of helps set the context of how I approach my course design and how I use these strategies within my individual classes. And so when we start to think about immersive and experiential learning strategies, it's important that we kind of focus on a couple of key things. One is that it's our underlying assumption that learners actually learn when they're working and solving real world problems or more authentic problems where they can apply a lot of the knowledge that we are giving them into addressing concrete things that they can relate to. We also know that what we have to do is we have to activate existing knowledge that they have. That helps build that transfer of relevancy into the course. So if a lot of our students have not had any type of experience or previous coursework in some of our classes, we have to figure out a little bit about who they are, what type of experience that they have, so that we can activate some of those knowledge elements to build on with the new knowledge that we're going to be providing to them. And then we also want to ensure that people understand what is expected, and we can do that by demonstrating what that activity, what that behavior is going to look like. And then we immediately have them apply that. So that's a very important kind of transition. So it's not just demonstrating, we want them to be able to apply that back to real world situations or real world issues that allow them to use their new knowledge. And then ultimately, we want to help them transfer what they learn in the classroom into their world. And I say their world because we've got probably a lot of different subject matter experts on this call. And so depending upon what your students are learning, whether it's preparing them for another class or preparing them for the workforce, we need to make sure that we're helping them translate this new knowledge into ways that are applicable to their personal circumstance. So as I kind of go through some of the aspects of the various strategies, keep these principles in mind, because these pretty much underlie everything that that I do in terms of how I design and structure my courses. So let me ask you, what are some things that you are doing specifically to engage your students? Just take a couple of minutes. Stephen talks about many assignments are application-based. That's great, Stephen. Using students' issues as teachable moments. Excellent. Explaining how the assignment connects to other classes or the workplace. Mark talked about utilizing current events. Mark, I do the same thing. I think that's one of the interesting things that we can do because there's plenty of them out there that we can draw. Using scenarios in which they apply concepts and principles, question their work. Excellent. So we're already doing some good things, and hopefully what I can share with you will enhance what you're doing and at least give you some things to think about to help you improve what you're doing in your own classes. Now, let me ask you, I've asked you, what are you doing to engage students, but how are you involving your students? Hannah talked about incorporating personal experiences. Angela brought up the big issue that I think a lot of us are dealing with, which is teaching virtually, and what does that mean in terms of our ability to be as engaging as we like. Angela, I feel the same way. I experience that as well. But are you actually involving your students in creating the engagement in the course. Mary talks about creating assessments that involve them. I think it was Mariah that, I apologize if I pronounce your name incorrectly. But she actually has them choose topics of interest and create and craft discussions in which they apply the concepts. So these are all, some great things that many of you are doing. Mark uses journals. One of the things that I do is at the very beginning of the semester, we actually spend about a third to sometimes as much as a half of the class discussing how we can create an engaging learning environment. I ask them what's important to them, what are some things that motivate and engage them, and we actually have a conversation, and we kind of come up with a class contract, to be quite honest with you, that I document and I post, out on the course site for everyone to refer back to. But the main thing that I do is it's not about what I can do, it's about what we do. I remember somebody mentioning in the chat the necessity for holding them accountable, or in some cases, students aren't necessarily as accountable. But this is something that I think it's important that we also hold them accountable for, because the learning experience is not just our responsibility, it's the class, it's the individual students' accountability as well. So don't forget to incorporate them in developing some of the engagement strategies that you utilize in your own course. I think that's a very effective way for them to feel empowered as well. Now, when we think about using immersive and experiential or problem-based learning, in this case, from what I'm going to talk to you about today, I think it's important to recognize that the underlying foundation of this is that we learn by doing, and we'll talk a little bit about the importance of the concept of learner presence as a way to engage them in what they're doing. And when students feel alienated or kind of outside or not connected, that level of presence is not there. And so they're not as engaged with the learning process, which may make them feel or appear to be less attentive and less focused on what we're doing either in class or throughout the course. And interestingly enough, in some research I did over the summer in looking at the mental health impact on employees, that was one of the biggest things that we started to see is the concept of what we call presenteeism, which is, our employees are there, they're performing work, but they're not as engaged, they're not as attentive and focused on what they're doing. And that's due to, all of the external influences that are affecting them, the COVID issues, the social injustice issues, the stress of work with lockdowns and, some businesses, going out of business or, laying people off. So there's a lot of mental stress going on there. So part of what we're seeing at the student level as well is something very similar because of all the pressures and issues that people are experiencing today that's affecting their level of presence in the learning process, and something we have to keep in mind. We also know that, as we increase learner empowerment through interactivity, right, that helps improve overall engagement as well. And then ultimately, we want to increase, levels of motivation, which affect knowledge retention and transfer of the knowledge and skills that we're teaching. So when we start to engage in using, even in portions, these types of strategies, we can see significant effects in overall learner engagement. So for some of you, you may be using some of these strategies, some of you may not, but I thought it would be helpful just to at least give you some information on what are the differences. When we think of immersive learning, we typically look at more technology-driven environments, and that's why I use the phrase environment-centered strategy, right? That we basically either simulate or create environments that immerse these students in a way that puts them in the center of some sort of environment where they have the ability to have a level of control of what's going on, a premise or a concept that we call agency in this context. Now, we counter that with a problem-based strategy, which is much more problem-centered. In other words, the students typically will work either individually, but normally in groups, and they will work to solve or work through a particular real life issue or problem. And there's varying levels of technology that can be incorporated. As Dr. Bertrand will go over, he will show you an example of some work that his team has done in VR, which immerses people in, gives them control, allows them to be present in the actual scenario. But we can do that in a non-technology environment as well through various problems and guided discovery activities that can require technology, but are not necessarily required. And I'm going to give you an example of how I've actually structured an entire class around a specific problem. So I wanted just to kind of give you a little bit of background on the difference between immersive and problem-based learning. Now, when I start to design any type of class, and I use Merrill's first phases of effective instruction, which comes out of his first principles of instruction, I use this model to help me structure the course, but also certain classes that I teach. And what I want you to get out of this is, first and foremost, how the phases operate around a problem. Okay, the problem is the central component to making this model work. So we have a problem or an issue that we want students to work through. One of the things that we have to do at the very beginning in stage one is we have to activate that prior knowledge, which I've mentioned to you before. So we can do that in a variety of ways, and many of you have shared some of the examples that you have used, whether it's things that they see in the environment, personal experiences. If we understand a little bit about our students in terms of their background and experience level, we can utilize that to our advantage to use that understanding to develop a baseline of knowledge and skills that we can then build on. Because that's the basic premise. We want to activate that underlying knowledge, and then we add to that, we build new knowledge from that. Now, when we move into the demonstration component, that's really what we would typically consider the core instructional phase, right? So we're demonstrating what we want them to do, the behaviors, the tasks, the calculations, the analyses that we want them to learn. And we demonstrate it, and then we let them apply it with feedback, right? And so that's kind of the core piece, this bottom two phases. We demonstrate it, and we have them apply it. And the key here is obviously giving them relevant feedback to help them start to calibrate and refine that understanding, that knowledge of what we want them to do. But again, everything is centered around a core problem that they're working through. And then lastly, we want to help them integrate what they've learned into their respective area of either subject matter progression or in the workplace. And so helping them begin to transition the application of that knowledge and skill becomes absolutely critical. And that also builds on the core aspects of being very relevant to them, so that they can actually see the connection to what they're doing in the classroom and outside of the classroom. Another model that really I use to kind of help frame how I approach my course design comes really out of more of the IV literature. And this is the cognitive affective model of immersive learning. And we could probably spend a couple of hours talking through each one of these, and we don't have that kind of time, but I want to point out a couple of things. The first thing that we have to look at is the various factors that influence whether or not the learner feels like they are present or in the moment of the actual learning itself. They're connected to what's going on, as well as how much control they have over what's going on. So there's a couple of factors, and in the IV world, we look at the technology factors, but you can actually use some of these in terms of non-technology type courses as well. So we want to look at the concept of immersion, and while there's a definition that we look at in terms of IV systems, I want you to think about it in terms of how do we immerse them into the issue or the problem that they're going to be working through. So how connected and how well do they understand what's being asked of them? And then there's various control factors, and this looks at how much control do they have over the learning process, but also the environment. And when Jeff shows you an example of one of the VR simulations that they have built, you'll be able to see some of these control factors in operation. And then lastly is the representational fidelity. In other words, that's how close the problem or the environment that's been created models what they're actually going to be using and doing in an actual situation. And those factors then translate into the degree or level of presence and agency that the learners feel. The higher the levels of presence and agency, then we start to see increases in various motivational factors such as interests, the motivation. And when we talk about interests, generally at the beginning of any type of course, you have situational interest. Now, we hope that translates into intrinsic interest, but that's not always the case. But we can increase engagement by simply increasing the level of situational interest. Their overall motivation and attitude toward the actual program itself or the course, increased levels of self-efficacy, embodiment, cognitive load, and self-regulation. All of these elements are influenced by the levels of presence and agency. And then if we design our course effectively, then that leads us into higher learning outcomes as you see in this last box. So that's in essence the theoretical framework that this model is trying to relay. So at this point, I wanted to kind of give you some examples of some real life courses that have either been developed through VR or I'm going to give you a problem based example here in just a moment. But Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of give some context to what our participants are going to see and have you share a little bit about what your team did in this scenario.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, this has been a very interesting talk so far. This is pretty much hitting all of our main points for building our virtual simulations. So this video just shows a couple different examples of our virtual simulations. This allows the student, in this case, to maneuver this robot here and pick up the payload and place it on the conveyor belt back there. So this gives the student just kind of like a spatial reason, a view of performing this task. So yeah, you can go ahead and hit play.
Okay.
And you can probably mute the volume too.
There we go.
Yep. Yeah, so this just kind of walks the student through learning different parts. In this case, this is for our photonics simulations. This is teaching the student how to fabricate a preform in order to build fiber optic cables. So you can see this is taking the student step by step through the whole process of using this MCVD lathe. And in the real world, this lathe is a multi-million-dollar machine. So it's best to practice on a virtual simulation before going into it in the real world. So the student can make mistakes. They can get immediate feedback on how well they perform the task and so forth. And so again, here's some more examples of our robotic simulations. Again, this is letting the student practice using the robot to do a variety of tasks.
And Jeff, just a question as you're kind of walking us through this.
Mm-hmm.
Are the students at a desktop computer? Are they using virtual reality headsets? How are they operating this?
So that's a good point. So the vast majority of our simulations are desktop based. So you just need a browser to access them. But we do have some of our simulations in an immersive environment. So the one that you just saw before was where the user is using a headset to look around the aircraft. But for accessibility, most people are going to have a desktop or laptop to access these on a web browser.
Now, for the participants, on the call today, as you're looking at the simulation, I want you to kind of think about what we just talked about in terms of the cognitive affective model, in terms of the degree of immersion, in that, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, you're more the subject matter on this than I am, but a lot of that depends on how immersed they are in the environment. So whether it's a desktop or they're actually using headsets where they can visualize and feel that they're in a specific environment. The level of control factors that you saw, the students engaged with, those all determine that concept of presence and agency. And then, of course, the representational fidelity. How does this environment, translate to mimicking what operational environment they're going to be operating in? And of course, you've touched on some of the critical nature of the criticality and the severity of what students are doing, and being able to do this in a very safe and cost-effective way, is a definite advantage. There was a question that I think by Dave, who is the person with simulators included? Yeah, we'll make sure Jeff's contact information gets sent out to everyone as well. Are there any other questions for Jeff? Jeff, any final thoughts that you'd like to add before I move on?
No, this is a really good talk. This is really good to show the motivation for building our virtual simulation. So thank you very much.
And, before I move on too far, one of the things that I think, Jeff, I would mention, for your benefit as well, one of the things that we've started here at Florida State is we've got an innovation hub, and we actually have a virtual reality lab. But we've started to build a cross-university, I guess you would call it kind of a community of practice or student interest group. But we actually teach students and faculty how to code in VR languages. And so we actually teach people how to develop their courses, or at least elements of their courses, using this technology. And one of the things I do, and Tammy had the benefit of experiencing this, for my training and development class, I usually do a rotational assignment, and I take people over to our virtual reality lab and let them play with different types of VR simulations. And then one of the things that we do is we come back and we talk about, okay, you've had a chance to experience this and play around with it for a little bit. How can you utilize this technology in developing corporate training? Because many students haven't had that experience, and so it's very beneficial just to let them even kind of play around with the different tools and technologies that they could potentially be utilizing in practice. So Jeff, thank you very much for taking a few minutes with us on that. I want to kind of close out today by switching from the immersive side to more of the experiential side. And I've mentioned to all the participants before that one of the things that I have done is I've actually used these concepts in structuring the course. And so the example that I'm going to share with you is in a course that I actually built around a core problem. And the problem that we experience and work through in the entire course is the foundation for how the course is actually designed. So hopefully this might give you some new ideas or some things to think about for your respective courses as well. But I wanted to start off by just giving you a little bit of detail on what differentiates problem-based learning from others. And many of you may be using some of these strategies, but as I mentioned, there is some sort of issue or problem, world problem that they're going to be working through. And the students really take the lead. My job is actually to facilitate them through this process, provide them the guidance necessary, information. We develop the skills through some of our in-class work and homework. But the students really take the lead on identifying, some of the information that they may need that, of course, I kind of guide and direct them toward. And then by understanding, how this project, comes together, they really have a good sense of how to apply all of the aspects, even the minute calculations that we do, and they see the relevance of applying this throughout the project, but then more importantly, they see it as it translates into the workplace. So let me walk you through what I've put together. And I'm not going to read through everything, but I'm going to kind of give you some summary information, and then feel free to ask me some questions. And I would love to hear what some of you are doing as well. But this is actually a compensation management class that I teach, and I teach it at both the MBA level and for senior undergraduates that are majoring in management and risk management. And what I do is I basically construct these consulting teams at the beginning of the semester. And these consulting teams are assigned a small business. I've got good relationships with the community, and whether it's restaurants or mom and pop retail stores or small manufacturing facilities, I create these small consulting groups and I assign them to one of these individual businesses for the entire semester. Now, the premise is that I want them to learn, how we actually construct compensation within an organization. And so there's various phases that we go through in that development process. And I will say it's not as though they're all on site. There's classroom components, obviously, where I'm teaching them the fundamentals of how to do this work. But then there's a lot more application. And that's really what drives a lot of the learning for these students. So we are incorporating, the theory, the methodology, the calculations necessary, and the critical judgment that's necessary to make certain key decisions when they're doing this on their own. But one of the things that I found that students really enjoy, even though it's extremely challenging for them, and I'll explain some of the things that I do to them, as many of them say to me, is I really encourage the social interaction, and not just with the students, but the interactions that they have with the business owners, the business leaders, and the employees in these organizations actually is extremely valuable in their overall development as students. And then lastly, one of the key things that I do is I encourage failure. In fact, I tell the students at the beginning of the semester that I have talked with all of your clients, and I've told them to be difficult. Don't always respond. Don't provide them everything that they need, because that mimics the real world that they're going to go into. And so, I want them to also develop perseverance and resilience as we go through this, and being able to accept failure as a way to learn. So they really grow through this process in a lot more ways, and I'm constantly amazed every time I teach this class. The level of professionalism and the quality of the work that I see at the end of the semester versus the beginning of the semester. So I've outlined here just some of the key phases that we go through: market analysis, job evaluation, pay grade development, pay policy mix, which is looking at total compensation. So we look at both the pay, the wages and salary component, as well as the benefits. And the culmination of all of this is at the end of the semester, they provide a written report to the client. I have all of the clients come to 2 class periods because we can't get all the presentations done in one. And each group presents to their client as a consultant. And they get feedback, they get questions, so they learn how to think on their feet. They really understand the nuances of the analysis that they've done. And while it's sometimes very challenging for some of the students, feedback that I regularly get from this class is it was one of the more difficult classes they've ever had, but one of the most rewarding classes that they've had. And then probably the best feedback that I get is when I have students, who have left the university and they're working, and I get an email from them, 6 months to a year later saying, that stuff that we talked about in your comp class, I'm actually doing that right now, and I feel very confident in doing it. So it keeps them engaged because they can see how the content relates to actual practice. They get to apply all of the theories, all of the methodology that we go over in class and through the homework They get to actually do the calculations and analyze the calculations in a way that they're presenting recommendations back to these clients. And usually at least one or two of the groups every semester that I teach this class, some of the recommendations that they give, the client actually will utilize going forward. So it's been very beneficial, not only for the students, but also to the clients. So I never have a problem getting enough clients to support this type of project. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions on one of the ways that I've embedded problem-based learning into an overall course design. But more importantly, what are some of the other things that you are doing as well? Susie asked, do I make it possible for students located in other states? Yes, I do. That's probably one of the more challenging scenarios that I run into. Now, I do teach a performance systems analysis class, Susie. I'm actually teaching that class right now, and I've got students all over the world, including active military, both U.S. and other countries' military. And what I substitute there, I've done it a couple of ways. I've created more case scenarios that they work through. And how I structure that is I give them basically a client that they work through, and there's various cases that I give them of that same client. So they kind of have the opportunity to do the same type of work. It's just minus the same level of client interaction and engagement. So there's a lot more social interaction and information sharing amongst the small groups that I put together than with the client engagement. So I try to mimic it as much as I can, but the fidelity of what they would experience in a face-to-face scenario versus what we have to do remotely does differ. But students do seem to get some value out of that as well. Great question. Okay. Yep. We use something similar, and I love the comment. They hated it first, yeah, that's some of what I get. You get frustrations, you get obviously the group dynamic issues, but when they get to the end and you keep them focused on what the ultimate end game is, and they really find the value in it. And particularly the final report and the presentation, a lot of students will actually use that as portfolio material that they will actually share with employers when they interview for jobs. So yes, I have experienced the exact same thing. We have another program that's much more of a simulation-based program that's in our competitive dynamics class that's very similar to that. They're running a business, and we present them with all types of different scenarios that they have to deal with. And it's that love-hate relationship, but actually when they get out, they definitely value that experience. Well, if there are no other comments or elements to share, let me just say, kind of in closing, that there are challenges. While I've presented things from the standpoint of positive outcomes and all, we have to recognize that there are challenges. One is that faculty members and instructors have to look at their role a little bit differently. It's not the same lecturer who is pouring information to them and they're the recipients. This is an active role, and you spend a lot of time coaching, mitigating issues, particularly communication issues and engagement issues on certain elements of the projects. But it does require that the instructor recognize that their role is different. One of the challenges is, do I structure or utilize these strategies holistically, in other words, across the whole course, or is it better used in certain aspects of the course? You have to make that decision as the instructor as to what's best. I choose in some of my courses, just because of the nature of the content, that applying more of an experiential approach allows me to be more effective in leveraging the content that we have to cover in a more relevant, meaningful way. But there are some courses that it might be, I've got to cover this type of information in isolation. and then I can set up some sort of immersive or experiential components that allows them to apply that. So, that's an instructor level decision. I would just ask you to challenge yourself if you're continuing to struggle with engagement. Can I expand the way that I'm using these different strategies to increase my level of engagement and ultimately the performance of my student? There are technology challenges that we have, both in terms of our infrastructure, as well as the technical capability of the instructors. So that's a real challenge. So how do we support our instructors in these situations? We also have to recognize the importance of skill development and problem solving, right? And sometimes with content-oriented courses, that's a little bit more of a challenge. And one of the things that I try to coach my faculty on is, and this is a common problem, when we talk about engagement, a lot of times what we're talking about is how are we actually designing the course? Is it effectively designed? And what I mean by that is a lot of times what happens is we have instructors and faculty that design the course from a content perspective. In other words, we're sequencing content. Probably, I would guess if your faculty are like mine, it's based on the sequence of maybe a textbook or a traditional way of structuring the content. But that's not really going to drive engagement the way that we've talked about today. And so looking at it in terms of the end goal, what is it that I want my students to be able to do and designing the course from that perspective versus the content perspective, right? That way I can insert content at certain points along the way, as well as, putting in different types of activities and scenarios and problem situations that they work through and use the content. So it looks, at structuring the way that our course is designed a little bit differently. And then lastly, being able to create a supportive environment and figuring out the most effective way to assess students. That's always a challenge here. Some of that is us as instructors thinking about assessment a little bit differently than the traditional exam-based approach, which puts a lot more onus on us to differentiate performance levels, but that's always a challenge, and then continuing to be able to support our learners throughout. Thank you, Zach. Zach talked about one of his instructors didn't teach at all, but conducted a class discussion. And the discussion was difficult and challenging, but provided some insight on how to tackle the problem. Yep, good. Well, let me open it up for any final questions. So my last slide is if you think back to some of the initial challenges that we talked about at the very beginning of the session today, we talked about factors such as motivation, the ability to connect, the relevant information to real world scenarios, at least to the student's perspective, increasing the level of satisfaction. So when we apply these immersive and experiential learning strategies, we tend to see higher levels of motivation, transferability, and overall satisfaction with the learning experience itself, which usually translates into higher learning outcomes that we talked about earlier. Yes, Mina, you talked about a lot of Val's work. Yes, and I think that's going to really change the nature of how we embed assessments. And in fact, we've actually, when I was before my academic days, we actually started looking at using stealth assessments, from a context that we actually gathered information on benefits decisions and things of that nature, so we could track information behind the scenes versus being in the face of our employees, which a lot of times they were more reluctant to share that kind of information. That Val's work is I think got a lot of good tangents that can go in a lot of different directions. So I would agree with you there. So I know everybody's getting at a hard stop. I've got a 3 o'clock session myself. I've got to run to class, but I did want to thank everybody for your time today. Here's my contact information. Tammy, I'm sure you're going to be sending the PowerPoint deck out as well with some additional information. So if anybody would like to talk with me further to not only talk about today's discussion, but also to brainstorm and share some best practices maybe that you're doing, I'd love to learn from all of you as well. So thank you for your time. And Tammy, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close out the session.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you so much, Dr. Brooks, for this informative session and spending your very valuable time with us today. We so appreciate it. And unless there are any other questions, because at this point in time, contact us at cucwd@clemson.edu, and we will do our best to respond to all your queries. And hopefully you found this webinar to be valuable and you would be able to leverage all the information provided to enhance learning experiences for your learners. Your feedback is very important to us. We request you to spend a few minutes of your time completing our post-webinar survey, which will be sent shortly to your inboxes. Our next webinar will be held on Tuesday, February 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This webinar will be presented by Dr. Logan Arrington. In this webinar, we will discuss the importance of selecting appropriate media for your instructional process. And we will look at example situations and discuss the rationale for selecting appropriate tools. So do plug in. We also encourage you to visit our CUCWD's website, where you will find a list of all our programs and our previous webinar series. Once again, thank you to all our participants for their time and active participation. We look forward to seeing you all in our next webinar. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you all.